The sterile scent of rubbing alcohol clung to the air in the small room, a fragrance Clara Hayes had come to associate not with healing, but with the slow, relentless passage of time. Her fingers, practiced and gentle, adjusted the thin cotton blanket over her mother's frail form, the gesture as automatic as her own breathing. Every fold of the fabric, every whisper of the oxygen machine in the corner, was a note in the monotonous symphony of her life. At 23, Clara was a certified home care nurse, yet her most demanding patient was the one who shared her name in her cramped working-class apartment. She moved with a quiet efficiency that masked a profound weariness, a hollowness in her chest that no amount of duty or love seemed to fill. This room, with its faded floral wallpaper and ever-present shadow of illness, was her entire world. A world built on sacrifice, but what happens when the one thing you need to save your family is the one thing that could destroy you? If you want to know how far she's willing to go, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. Clara Hayes was a study in muted colors, from her simple, practical clothes to the subdued hope in her soft gray eyes. Her youth was a thing she observed in others, a bright, distant country she'd only ever seen on a map but had never been allowed to visit. The path from her teenage years to now had been a straight, unyielding line drawn by her mother's illness. A journey that bypassed all the normal landmarks of early adulthood: careless laughter, foolish mistakes, the clumsy, heart-stopping discovery of a first love. Her days were a closed loop, a predictable orbit around her mother's needs and the crushing weight of their mounting medical debt. She existed in a state of suspended animation, her own dreams and desires packed away like old photographs, too painful to look at but impossible to throw away. Her virginity was not a statement or a conscious moral choice, but a simple, unadorned consequence of her life's architecture. It was a room in her soul that had never been entered, its door quietly closed not by a lock, but by the sheer absence of anyone ever knocking. While girls her age were navigating the thrilling, terrifying landscapes of romance and intimacy, Clara was learning the precise calibrations of medication dosages and the art of changing bed linens without causing pain. The concept of a man's touch, one that wasn't clinical or familial, felt like a foreign language she might have once wanted to learn, but for which she no longer had the time or a textbook. It was another deferred dream, a quiet ache that resonated in the lonely hours after her mother had fallen asleep, leaving Clara alone with the silence and the ghost of a life unlived. Their apartment was a physical manifestation of their struggle, a small, two-bedroom box where the walls seemed to be closing in with each new medical bill that arrived. The paint on the windowsill was peeling, a silent testament to years of neglect, and the sofa sagged in the middle from the weight of countless sleepless nights. Every object held a story of financial compromise: the mismatched chairs around the small kitchen table, the flickering television set that someone had left on the curb, the threadbare rugs that failed to muffle the sounds of their neighbors' louder, more vibrant lives. This space, which should have been a sanctuary, felt more like a cage, its bars forged from love, duty, and a poverty that was as chronic as her mother's illness. The air was thick with unspoken fears, the most prominent being the threat of eviction that loomed over them like a gathering storm. Her mother, Eleanor, was the sun around which Clara's universe revolved, a source of immense warmth and a gravitational pull that kept her from flying away. Even in her weakened state, Eleanor possessed a sharp wit and a deep, abiding love for her daughter that was both a comfort and a burden. Clara would often read to her in the evenings, her voice a soft murmur that filled the quiet space between them. In those moments, seeing a flicker of the vibrant woman her mother once was, Clara felt a surge of fierce, protective love. But it was always followed by a wave of guilt, a silent acknowledgement that this love was also her anchor, holding her in place while the rest of the world sailed on without her. She knew her mother sensed this, saw the sacrifice in her daughter's tired eyes, and that shared, unspoken knowledge was the most painful secret between them. Sometimes late at night, Clara would stand by the living room window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. The city sprawled below, a glittering tapestry of a million other lives, each one a story she couldn't begin to imagine. She would watch the distant headlights of cars moving freely along the highway and feel a profound, almost unbearable longing. It was a yearning for something as simple as anonymity, the freedom to walk down a street without the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her shoulders. She craved a touch that asked for nothing in return, a conversation that wasn't about symptoms or finances, a single moment where she could be just Clara, not a caregiver, not a daughter, but a young woman standing on the precipice of her own life, wondering if she would ever be allowed to jump. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a stark white envelope with a red final notice stamped across it. It wasn't a medical bill this time, but a letter from their landlord, the words cold and clinical, giving them 30 days. It lay on the kitchen table, a declaration of war they had no weapons to fight. That same afternoon, a call from Dr. Evans confirmed their worst fears. The new experimental treatment that represented their last sliver of hope would not be covered by their insurance. The cost was astronomical, a figure so laughably out of reach it might as well have been $1 billion. As Clara hung up the phone, the world went silent. The hollowness in her chest was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The time for quiet sacrifice was over. She would do anything, compromise any part of herself, to save her mother. It was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. The city awoke with a tired groan, a symphony of distant sirens and the rumble of the early morning train that vibrated through the thin floorboards of Clara's bedroom. Gray light filtered through the single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and casting long shadows from the stacks of medical books on her small desk. Her routine was a silent, meticulously choreographed ballet of necessity. She moved through the cramped apartment with a practiced economy of motion, her footsteps muffled on the worn linoleum floor. Preparing her mother's morning medication, checking the oxygen levels, and setting a simple breakfast on a tray were all performed before the sun had fully crested the neighboring brick buildings. This apartment wasn't just a home. It was a self-contained world, a fortress against the larger one outside, and she was its solitary, vigilant guard, perpetually on duty. Every dawn felt less like a new beginning and more like the turning of a familiar, heavy page. Her commute was a daily immersion in the city's indifferent current. On the crowded bus, she pressed herself against a window slick with condensation, a ghost among the living. She watched the faces around her, some etched with exhaustion, others bright with a purpose she couldn't fathom, and felt an invisible wall between herself and them. They were heading to offices, to colleges, to lives that branched out in 1,000 different directions, while her own path felt like a single, unswerving track leading back to the same station. The city was a vast, sprawling organism of connection and opportunity, yet she moved through its arteries like a foreign body, observing but never truly participating. Her isolation was most profound here, surrounded by a sea of humanity, yet feeling utterly, completely alone, her own quiet anxieties a silent hum beneath the roar of the bus engine. Clara's part-time job was at a state-funded long-term care facility, a place that smelled of disinfectant and quiet despair. Here, her professional compassion was stretched thin, a resource as depleted as their medical supplies. She spent her hours attending to the needs of forgotten souls, men and women whose families visited infrequently, if at all. Her supervisor, a harried woman named Mrs. Gork, Gable, prized efficiency over empathy, often chiding Clara for lingering too long with a patient who simply wanted to hold a hand or tell a story. "We're not here to be friends, Hayes," she'd say, her voice sharp. "We're here to keep them clean and medicated." Clara would nod, but her heart rebelled. She saw in the clouded eyes of her patients a reflection of her own mother's vulnerability, and it fueled a quiet, simmering anger at a system that measured human value in billable hours and neatly checked boxes. The pressure wasn't confined to her professional or home life. It seeped in through the phone lines, carried on the well-meaning but misguided words of her extended family. Her Aunt Carol would call every Sunday, her voice a syrupy blend of concern and judgment. She'd inquire about Eleanor's health before inevitably pivoting to Clara's future. "A pretty girl like you, all alone," she'd sigh. "You know, my neighbor's son David is a good man, an accountant. He could give you a stable life, help with your mother." The implication was always clear. Clara's sacrifice was admirable, but ultimately foolish. A husband was the proper solution, a man to assume her burdens. Each conversation left Clara feeling diminished, as if her own strength and dedication were not achievements, but symptoms of a life gone wrong. A problem that only a man and a marriage certificate could solve. Back in the quiet of her apartment, The true nature of her prison became starkly clear. She would lay the bills out on the kitchen table under the flickering fluorescent light, the numbers a hostile army laying siege to her resolve. The eviction notice was a constant, glaring presence, but it was the denial letter for the new immunotherapy treatment that truly broke her heart. It represented a specific, tangible hope, a chance for her mother to have a few more good days, a little less pain, and it was locked behind a paywall she could never hope to scale. The figures blurred together, a dizzying testament to her own inadequacy. Love and duty were noble, but they couldn't pay for prescriptions or keep a roof over their heads. She felt a cold desperation creeping in, a willingness to consider paths she would have once deemed unthinkable. In a quiet moment, as Clara was adjusting her mother's pillows, Eleanor's hand, thin and fragile as a bird's wing, reached out and clutched her arm. Her eyes, though clouded with fatigue, were sharp and lucid. "I see the weight you carry, my girl," she whispered, her voice raspy. "I never wanted this for you. I had so many dreams for you, Clara. Don't let me be the reason you never chase them." The words, meant to absolve, only twisted the knot of guilt tighter in Clara's stomach. It was an impossible paradox. The very person she was sacrificing everything for was begging her to stop. This loving, oppressive bond was the most complex part of her cage, a beautiful prison from which she both wanted and was terrified to escape. Her mother's love was her reason for fighting, but it was also the heaviest chain of all. That night, bathed in the cold blue light of her laptop, Clara ventured into the world of private care, a realm of wealth and privilege that felt like a different planet. She scrolled past dozens of standard postings until one caught her eye. It was from a discreet, high-end placement agency specializing in, quote, unique and demanding long-term assignments. The description was vague, citing the need for absolute confidentiality and unflinching professionalism. But the compensation listed was a figure that made her stop breathing. It was more than she could earn in 5 years at the facility. It was enough. Enough for the treatment. Enough to tear up the eviction notice. Enough to finally let her mother rest without the shadow of debt looming over her. It felt dangerous and unreal, a lifeline thrown from a world she did not belong to. Hesitantly, she sent an inquiry. The response was almost immediate, a crisp, impersonal email summoning her for an interview the very next day. It stipulated that she would have to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement before even learning the prospective client's name or the specific nature of the ailment. The secrecy was a blaring red flag, a warning her instincts screamed at her to heed. This wasn't just a job, it was an arrangement, a transaction shrouded in mystery. The agency's name, Aegis Solutions, sounded more like a private security firm than a healthcare provider. A profound sense of unease settled over her, the feeling of stepping toward a door that, once opened, could never be closed again. The money was a promise of freedom, but the conditions felt like the first links of a new, more gilded chain. Pacing the small strip of floor between the sofa and the kitchen, Clara waged a silent war with herself. Every moral fiber, every lesson in professional ethics she had ever learned, told her to run. The job felt exploitative, a rich person buying not just her skills but her silence and her compliance. She imagined a world of cold marble floors and colder personalities, a place where her compassion would be treated as a commodity. Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's pained smile and the stark white of the final notice from their landlord. What was her moral code worth if it led to her mother's suffering? What was her freedom if it was the freedom to be poor, helpless, and watch the person she loved most in the world fade away? The choice was becoming brutally simple: compromise her principles or abandon her mother to fate. She stood by her mother's bedside, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest in the dim light. In sleep, Eleanor looked peaceful, the deep lines of pain on her face momentarily smoothed away. Clara reached out, her fingers gently brushing a stray strand of gray hair from her mother's forehead. This was the only thing that mattered. This love, fierce and absolute, was her true north. All the noise of her fears, her doubts, and the world's expectations faded into a single, clarifying point of focus. Her own future could wait, her own heart could be mended later. She walked back to the kitchen, her decision made. Picking up her phone, she found the number for Aegis Solutions. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear. betraying none of the turmoil within. "I'm calling to confirm my attendance for the interview tomorrow." The address belonged not to a building, but to a monument of modern ambition, a shard of smoked glass and black steel that pierced the clouds, indifferent to the gritty, earthbound city below. As Clara stepped out of the taxi, she felt her own insignificance magnified, a small, soft thing about to be swallowed by this giant of sterile wealth. The lobby was a cathedral of silence, paved in white marble that echoed her hesitant footsteps, the air chilled to an unnatural coolness. A private elevator, all polished chrome and silent ascent, carried her upward, the city shrinking into a geometric pattern through the glass wall. With each floor she passed, she felt a layer of her old life peeling away, the weight in her chest a mixture of terror and a strange, exhilarating vertigo. She was rising to meet a monster or miracle, and she no longer knew which she feared more. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, a vast, cavernous space that seemed to defy gravity. The air smelled of nothing, a purified, clinical emptiness that was more unsettling than any distinct odor. Floor-to-ceiling windows on three sides presented a panoramic, godlike view of the world she had just left behind. It was a landscape of untouchable beauty, silent and remote. The walls were adorned with massive, abstract paintings, violent slashes of color and stark, lonely shapes that seemed to scream into the crushing silence. The furniture was sparse, sculptural, and cold, arranged with a precision that suggested it was meant to be looked at, not lived in. This was not a home. It was a gallery curated by a ghost, a gilded cage suspended between the sky and the earth, and Clara felt its profound, suffocating loneliness instantly. A woman with a severe posture and a face devoid of expression met her at the threshold. Her name was Ms. Finch, and her voice was as starched and colorless as her gray suit. She did not offer a handshake or a smile, only a thin tablet on which Clara was to sign the final pages of the non-disclosure agreement. "Mr. Thorne values his privacy above all else," Ms. Finch stated, her words clipped and final. "You will not speak of what you see here, who you meet here, or the nature of your duties to anyone. Your discretion is not a request, it is the primary condition of your employment. Any breach will be met with immediate and severe legal consequences. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, her throat suddenly dry. The words were a warning, drawing the bars of the cage tighter around her even before she had met its occupant. Miss Finch led her through an impossibly long hallway into a study. A man sat in a high-backed leather chair, his form a dark silhouette against the blazing afternoon sun flooding the window behind him. He didn't turn. The city sprawled at his feet like a conquered territory. "The new nurse, Mr. Thorne," Ms. Finch announced to the back of his head. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken power. Clara could hear the faint hum of an air filtration system and the frantic beating of her own heart. Then, a voice emerged from the shadow, low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Leave us." It was a command, not a request, and it dismissed the formidable Miss Finch as if she were a common servant. The door clicked shut, leaving Clara alone with the silhouette, a prisoner in a sun-drenched room. He swiveled the chair slowly, a deliberate, theatrical movement designed to unnerve. The light caught his face, and Clara instinctively braced herself. What she saw was not a monster, but a man etched with the geography of his pain. Faint silvery scars traced patterns along his jawline and the visible skin of his neck, disappearing into the collar of his dark cashmere sweater. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a piercing, intelligent blue, utterly exhausted yet burning with a defiant, analytical fire. They scanned her from head to toe, dissecting her cheap but clean uniform, her nervous hands, her determinedly neutral expression. "Another one," he murmured, his lip curling into a sneer. "Tell me, Clara Hayes, how much debt are you in that you're willing to stomach this?" Clara felt a flush of anger, hot and sharp, but she forced it down, channeling it into a rigid professionalism. This was a test, and she would not fail it. She met his cold, assessing gaze without wavering. "My financial situation is not relevant to my professional duties, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice much steadier than she felt. "The agency hired me to provide comprehensive in-home nursing care. I'm here to review your medical chart, understand your current treatment regimen, and begin my work. She deliberately used the clinical language of her profession, creating a shield of detached competence. She was not a charity case to be pitied or a curiosity to be dissected. She was a nurse. In this room, that was her only identity, and she clung to it like a life raft. His cynical smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of surprise. He seemed unused to being met with professional steel instead of fear or sycophantic pity. He extended his right arm, resting it on the arm of the chair. A raw, inflamed lesion, poorly dressed, was visible just below his rolled-up sleeve. It was an ugly, angry wound, and he presented it like a challenge, a dare. "My chart is irrelevant," he said, his voice a low growl. "My body is the only text you need to read. Let's see if you have the stomach for the language it speaks." The invitation was a threat, a deliberate act of aggression meant to send her running, just like all the others. He was testing the limits of her composure, waiting for the inevitable moment of revulsion. Clara moved without hesitation. She placed her medical bag on the floor and knelt beside his chair, a gesture of service that paradoxically gave her a strange sense of control. She was on his level now, the world of his pain, her sole focus. She pulled on a pair of sterile gloves with a brisk, efficient snap, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "This dressing is inadequate. It's allowing too much air to the wound, which increases the risk of infection," she stated, her tone clinical and matter-of-fact. Her fingers, sure and steady, began to gently peel back the old gauze. She did not look at his face, focusing only on the task, on the damaged skin, treating it not as a source of horror, but as a problem to be solved with care and precision. As her gloved fingertips made contact with the inflamed skin around the wound, a current passed through the air between them. His entire body went rigid, a silent, sharp intake of breath, the only sign of his reaction. She worked with a focused grace, cleaning the area with an antiseptic wipe. Her touch was everything he was unaccustomed to. It was firm, but gentle, efficient, but not rushed, and utterly, completely devoid of fear. It was an unflinching touch. It did not pity him or recoil from him. It simply treated him. It was a professional act, yet it felt more profoundly intimate than any touch he had experienced in years. In that moment, she was not seeing his wealth or his reputation or his scars. She was seeing only his pain, and her hands offered a quiet, competent answer to it. When she finished applying a new, clean dressing, she looked up and met his eyes. The cynical armor was gone, and for a fleeting second, she saw something else in their depths, a raw, stunning vulnerability. It was the shock of a man who had been starving for so long he had forgotten what nourishment felt like. He was captivated, not by her beauty or her charm, but by her simple, professional refusal to be horrified by him. The power dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. The silence that settled was no longer his weapon, but a shared space of fragile, unspoken acknowledgement. "You will be here at 8 tomorrow morning," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier venom, now quiet and absolute. As Miss Finch escorted her out, Clara felt his gaze on her back, a brand of intense, unnerving focus that told her she had not just been hired for a job, but conscripted into something far more dangerous. The days settled into a strange, disquieting rhythm, a silent pact governed by the sterile snap of latex gloves and the low hum of the penthouse's climate control. Clara would arrive at 8 sharp, the elevator's ascent a daily transition between two worlds, the gritty, demanding reality of her life below and this sterile, silent sanctuary in the sky. Julian Thorne was a puzzle of contradictions. He would spend hours in brooding silence, his gaze fixed on the city he owned but could not touch, then suddenly pivot to a sharp, incisive interrogation about the chemical composition of a particular antiseptic she was using. His moods were a volatile landscape she learned to navigate with cautious precision. She remained the consummate professional, a bastion of calm efficiency. Yet she could feel his intense, analytical gaze on her constantly, dissecting not just her methods but her very essence. The true turning point came during the second week, when she had to perform the full wound care regimen on his back for the first time. The lesions there were extensive, a raw, angry map of his body's betrayal. As she prepared her instruments, he spoke from the treatment table, his voice laced with a familiar, bitter sarcasm. "Don't be shy, nurse. Most don't have the stomach for the main event. You can tell me when you're about to faint." He was watching her reflection in a polished chrome medical stand, waiting for the flicker of disgust, the hesitation that always came. Clara met his reflected gaze, her own expression unreadable. She simply cleansed her hands, her movements deliberate and sure. "You must be in a great deal of pain," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Let's make this as quick and comfortable as possible." His cynical retort died in his throat. A profound, stunned silence filled the room, broken only by the quiet clink of her instruments on the sterile tray. He had braced himself for revulsion, for pity, for feigned professionalism that barely masked horror. He was completely unprepared for her simple, direct acknowledgement of his suffering. As she worked, her touch was methodical and certain, a language of pure, unadorned competence. It was a touch that didn't judge or recoil. It simply tended to the damage. He remained perfectly still, his muscles rigid beneath her hands, but his mind was reeling. For the first time in years, he felt like a patient, not a monster. He was being treated, not endured. In the sterile quiet of the room, the first, most formidable wall around his heart began to crumble into dust. After that day, the nature of their interactions shifted. The silence became less a weapon and more a space for observation. His questions began to stray from the medical. "That book you're reading on the bus," he'd ask, his voice a low rumble from across the vast living area. "Is it any good?" Or, "You always look tired. Does she keep you up at night?" He was probing the edges of her life, collecting small, seemingly insignificant details with the focus of a master strategist. He wanted to understand the mechanics of her compassion, to find the source of that unflinching strength. He asked about her mother, about the nursing facility, about the life she had sacrificed. Each question was a carefully placed stone, testing the depth of the waters that separated them, and Clara found herself, against her better judgment, answering him. For Clara, these conversations were a dangerous indulgence. Sharing parts of herself felt like a transgression, a violation of the professional boundaries she had so carefully constructed. Yet, it was also intoxicating. No one had ever asked her these questions with such focused intensity. Julian Thorne saw her, not just the competent nurse or the dutiful daughter, but the weary, intelligent young woman beneath. He listened with an unnerving stillness that made her feel both completely exposed and profoundly heard. She would leave the penthouse each evening with her mind in a turmoil, the echo of his voice following her down in the silent elevator. She was an employee, a caregiver. But in those moments, talking about a favorite author or a difficult day, she felt something else entirely, something perilously close to a connection. One afternoon, a storm broke over the city, encasing the penthouse in a swirling cocoon of gray cloud and drumming rain. The power flickered, and for a few long minutes, the emergency lights cast the room in an eerie, intimate glow. Julian was in more pain than usual, a low-grade fever making him restless. He refused medication, opting instead to sit in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and listen to the storm. Clara stayed with him, not as a nurse, but as a quiet presence. He spoke, not to her directly, but to the rain-streaked window, about his father, a man who loved storms, and who had built the Thorne Empire with a ruthless genius that Julian had inherited like a genetic curse. It was a brief, unguarded glimpse into his past, and it made him achingly, heartbreakingly human. He fought against the dependency he felt growing within him. Some days he would revert to his old cruelty, his words designed to wound, to push her away, to prove that he needed no one. "Your compassion is a commodity, nurse," he sneered once after she had shown him a small kindness. "You're just better at selling it than the others." The words stung, but Clara saw the fear behind them. It was the desperate act of a man terrified of the very thing he craved. She didn't argue or retreat. She simply absorbed the blow, her silence a quiet refusal to participate in his self-destruction. Her steadiness infuriated him, and, in equal measure, drew him further in. He was accustomed to people fleeing from his darkness. He didn't know how to handle someone who simply stood her ground and waited for it to pass. To Clara, Julian's world was a constant source of fascination and fear. He would sometimes lead her through his private gallery, pointing out a painting by Rothko or a sculpture by Giacometti, explaining their emotional significance with a passion that was startlingly at odds with his usual cold demeanor. He showed her a world of immense beauty, culture, and intellectual rigor that made her own life feel small and colorless by comparison. She felt the seductive pull of it all, the quiet, the art, the view from the top of the world. It was a gilded cage, she knew, but the bars were so beautiful, and her own world was so full of pain and struggle. The temptation to simply rest within its confines, even for a little while, was becoming a powerful, persistent ache. Her awareness of him as a man, not just a patient, grew with a terrifying speed. It began as a subtle shift in her perceptions. She started to notice the way the dark fabric of his sweater stretched across his broad shoulders, the surprising strength in his hands when he gripped the arms of his chair, the deep, resonant timbre of his voice when he was tired. She found herself watching the line of his jaw when he was lost in thought, the intelligence that burned in his blue eyes even when they were clouded with pain. This new, unwelcome consciousness was a betrayal of her professional ethics, a dangerous current pulling her into uncharted waters. She had built her life on avoiding such complications, and now one was living in the very center of her carefully controlled world. The invisible line between them was finally irrevocably crossed one evening. He had been working too long at his desk, and when he stood, a sharp spasm of pain shot through his leg, causing him to stumble. Without thinking, Clara lunged forward, her hands finding his arm to steady him. Her fingers closed over the firm muscle beneath his cashmere sleeve, and in that instant, the world stopped. It was the first time she had touched him in a way that was not clinical, not mediated by the sterile barrier of a latex glove. His skin was warm, alive. A jolt, sharp and electric, passed between them. He froze, his gaze locking with hers, his eyes wide, with a raw, unguarded surprise that mirrored her own. The air crackled with the sudden, shocking intimacy of the contact. They sprang apart as if burned, the moment of contact hanging between them, shimmering and dangerous. Neither of them spoke. Clara retreated to the other side of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs, her cheeks flushed with a heat that had nothing to do with embarrassment. It was pure, unadulterated awareness. The professional boundary had been vaporized. She was no longer just his nurse, and he was no longer just her patient. They were a man and a woman, alone in a silent room high above the world, and the knowledge of it was a terrifying, exhilarating weight. For the rest of the evening, they moved around each other with a new, cautious gravity, the space between them now charged with everything that had been left unsaid and unfelt for so long. A few days later, the full, crushing reality of her situation came crashing down. She was on a brief break, speaking quietly on the phone with her mother's doctor in a secluded corner of the penthouse. The news was bad. The hospital was threatening to discontinue care if a significant payment wasn't made within the week. Her voice broke on a whispered plea for more time, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering. She didn't know that Julian was standing in the shadowed archway of the adjoining room, listening to every desperate word. He heard the tremor in her voice, the quiet desperation of a daughter willing to beg for the life of her mother, and something inside him, something long dormant and hardened by years of cynical isolation, broke. He saw the full weight she carried, and he understood its crushing power. He watched her hang up the phone and struggle to compose herself, her back to him. In that moment, he saw her not as an employee, but as the only source of light in his suffocating darkness. And he knew, with a terrible selfish certainty, that he could not let her go. The idea that had been forming in the back of his mind now solidified into a concrete plan. It was a monstrous, possessive, and desperate impulse. He could save her. He could erase all her problems with a simple bank transfer. He could buy her mother the best care in the world. He could give her a life free from financial terror. In return, he would have her. He would own her unflinching touch, her quiet strength, her calming presence. It was a transaction, not a romance, a way to chain her to him with gratitude and gold. Clara felt herself being pulled into a moral and emotional vortex. Her feelings for Julian were a tangled mess of pity, admiration, fear, and a burgeoning, terrifying desire. She was drawn to his brilliant, wounded mind and the vulnerability he tried so desperately to hide. The thought of his touch, which she had once dreaded, now sent a shiver of anticipation through her. Was this genuine affection, a real connection forged in the crucible of their shared isolation? Or was it some twisted form of gratitude, a psychological response to the first man who had ever truly seen her? She felt like she was losing control, not just of the professional situation, but of her own heart, a heart she had guarded so fiercely for so long. His vulnerability became her undoing. One night, as she was helping him with a simple task, his hand brushed hers, and he didn't pull away. He looked at her, his eyes stripped of all their usual defenses, and spoke of a small, painful memory, a childhood dog that had been his only friend, taken away by his indifferent father. It was a tiny crack in his fortress, but it let in a flood of light. It was a piece of his pain given freely, a gift of trust that left her breathless. The story wasn't a grand confession, but it was an acknowledgement of their shared humanity, a quiet admission that he too had once been a lonely child who loved something unconditionally. It deepened her empathy until it felt indistinguishable from affection. Her role in his life was no longer clear. Miss Finch once made a condescending remark about Clara's overly familiar approach, and Clara, to her own shock, found herself defending her methods with a quiet but fierce intensity. She realized, with a jolt, that her loyalty had shifted. It was no longer just to her professional code of conduct, but to him, to the broken man hidden beneath the scars and the cynicism. She was becoming his protector, his confidant, his sole ally in a world that had long since cast him out. This fierce, protective instinct scared her more than anything. It was no longer about a job or paying her mother's bills. It was about him. And she knew, with a sinking feeling of inevitability, that she was in far too deep to ever find her way back. Standing at the vast penthouse window that evening, she looked down at the sprawling city lights, a glittering, indifferent galaxy below. Down there was her life, the cramped apartment, the unpaid bills, her mother's fragile breath. It was a life of duty, of love, of crushing responsibility. Up here, in this silent, beautiful cage, was Julian. Here was a different kind of life, one of dangerous intimacy, compromised freedom, and a desire that threatened to consume her entirely. She was caught between saving her family and saving herself, between the woman she was supposed to be and the woman this man was awakening within her. The choice loomed, vast and terrifying, and she felt herself standing on the edge of a precipice, the wind of an impossible decision threatening to sweep her away. The offer hung in the air between them, a tangible, shimmering thing of immense weight and terrifying possibility. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, a declaration of his intent to possess her. Julian had laid out the terms with the cold precision of a corporate takeover, offering salvation at the price of her soul. That night, Clara didn't leave. She stood by the window long after her shift had ended, watching the city lights blur into a watercolor painting through her unshed tears. She had called the hospital again, her voice a desperate whisper in the cavernous silence of the penthouse, and had been met with the same bureaucratic indifference. Time was gone. Options were gone. All that remained was this impossible choice, standing before her in the form of a broken, beautiful man who saw her as his only cure. She was a nurse, but this felt like a diagnosis of her own. He found her there, a lone, fragile silhouette against the glittering expanse of the city. He didn't speak at first, simply coming to stand a few feet away, the space between them charged with the gravity of his proposal. "You can't save her from down there," he said finally, his voice a low, rough murmur that was not unkind. "But I can save her from up here. All you have to do is stay." It was the simplest, most complex sentence she had ever heard. To stay, to abandon the pretense of professionalism, to forsake her small, suffocating apartment, to give up the illusion of a life she was never truly living anyway. She turned from the window to face him, the tears finally tracing a path down her cheeks. In her eyes he saw not surrender, but a fierce, devastating resolve. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a transgression against everything she was supposed to be, and the most honest choice she had ever made. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the private wing of the penthouse, and she followed. The act of following him down that long, silent hallway felt like a final, irreversible step into another world. He led her not to a guest room, but to his own. The space was a shock of Spartan intimacy, a stark contrast to the cold, gallery-like feel of the rest of the home. The walls were a deep charcoal gray, the bed a vast expanse of simple white linens. There was no art, no television, only a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf crammed with worn volumes of philosophy and poetry, and a single window that looked out not at the city, but at the empty, star-dusted sky. This was his sanctuary, his cell, the inner sanctum of his isolation. By bringing her here, he was not offering her a room. He was offering her access to himself, a key to the last locked door. He stopped in the center of the room, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with a tension that seemed to vibrate through the air. He began, his voice catching, the word a shard of glass in his throat. He couldn't finish. Instead, he made a small, frustrated gesture toward the buttons on his shirt cuff. It was an appeal, a silent admission of defeat. He couldn't bring himself to ask for help, but he was showing her his need. Clara moved forward, her own fear, a distant hum beneath the overwhelming surge of empathy. Her fingers, so accustomed to the clinical efficiency of medical tasks, trembled as she reached for his wrist. The warmth of his skin was a shock, a living, breathing reality that dissolved the last vestiges of their professional roles. She carefully, slowly undid the button, her knuckles brushing against his pulse, which hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her skin. He turned to face her then, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than desire, deeper than gratitude. It was a raw, terrifying vulnerability. He allowed her to unbutton his shirt, one slow, deliberate button at a time, each movement an act of profound trust. The fabric parted, and she saw him. Not just the scars she treated, but all of them, a pale, silvery network that mapped the history of his pain across the taut skin of his chest and shoulders. The moonlight from the window caught the damaged tissue, making it gleam like a tragic constellation. She lifted her hand, not as a nurse assessing a wound, but as a woman witnessing a soul. Her palm came to rest flat against his chest, her fingers tracing the edge of a long, faded scar. She felt his heart leap beneath her touch, a captured bird beating its wings against the cage of his ribs. A choked sound escaped his lips, and his eyes squeezed shut. "No one," he whispered, his voice fracturing under the weight of the confession. "No one has ever touched me there, without flinching." It was the simplest of statements, yet it contained the entire tragedy of his existence. It was the secret he had guarded with cruelty and cynicism, the core of his loneliness laid bare in the quiet intimacy of the room. He was not a monster. He was a man who had been starved of gentle, accepting contact for so long that her simple, unflinching touch was enough to shatter his world. In that moment, Clara understood that his proposition had never been about ownership. It was a desperate, clumsy plea for the one thing his money could never buy, a connection that was not afraid of his damage. Her heart broke for him, a clean, sharp break that let in a flood of feeling so powerful it stole her breath. Pity, compassion, and a fierce, protective tenderness converged into a single, undeniable truth: desire. She rose on her toes, her hands still resting over his heart, and closed the final inch of space between them. Her lips met his, tentatively at first, a soft question in the darkness. He froze for a single, stunned second, his entire body rigid with shock. Then, as if a dam had broken within him, he responded. His arms came around her, pulling her flesh against him, and his mouth claimed hers with a decade of pent-up hunger and desperate, aching loneliness. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a raw, frantic claiming, a drowning man's gasp for air. It tasted of whiskey, salt, and a profound, heartbreaking solitude. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, carrying her the few steps to the bed and laying her down on the cool, white linens. The world narrowed to the space between them, a universe defined by touch and breath. For Clara, this was the ultimate transgression, the final, terrifying leap from the precipice. Her virginity, a quiet, unexamined fact of her life, was now a conscious offering, a gift of trust she was choosing to give to this broken man. He moved with a reverence that undid her, his hands mapping her body as if she were a sacred text he was finally being allowed to read. He looked at her, his gaze intense and searching, as if memorizing every detail of her face in the moonlight. This was not the act of a cold millionaire claiming his purchase, but of a starving man being brought to a feast, overwhelmed by the grace of it all. Later, in the silent aftermath, they lay tangled in the sheets, the cool night air a soft whisper against their skin. His arm was a heavy, protective weight across her waist. His hand splayed possessively over her hip, even in sleep. His breathing was deep and even, the lines of pain on his face smoothed away for the first time since she had met him. He looked younger, almost peaceful. Clara lay awake, her body humming with a strange new language of sensation, her heart a wild, unsteady rhythm in her chest. She watched the slow rise and fall of his scarred chest, and felt a sense of profound, terrifying peace. The professional line had not just been crossed, it had been incinerated. The cage had closed around her, its bars no longer feeling like gilded steel, but like the strong, protective arms of the man sleeping beside her. She had come to this penthouse to earn money, to fulfill a duty, to save her mother. It had been a transaction, a means to an end. But as she lay there, listening to the steady beat of Julian's heart against her ear, she knew that everything had changed. She had traded her carefully constructed life for this single night, this one act of complete and total surrender. She felt a tremor of fear at the enormity of what she had done, at the unknown country she had just entered without a map. But beneath the fear was something else, something she hadn't felt in years, a spark of wild, exhilarating, dangerous hope. She had stepped into the darkness to find him, and in doing so, she was terrified to realize that she might have just, for the very first time, found herself. The dawn that followed was a violation, its cold, impartial light spilling into the room and stripping the night of its fragile magic. Clara awoke with a start, the space beside her in the vast bed already cool, the indentation on the pillow a fading ghost of his presence. A profound and terrifying silence had reclaimed the penthouse, amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. She felt a deep, primal shame, a sense of being utterly exposed and then discarded. On a chair across the room, her simple nurse's uniform was folded with impersonal precision, a stark, accusing symbol of her former self. It looked like the costume of a person she no longer was, a relic from a life she had set on fire. The intimacy they had shared now felt like a fever dream, and in the sterile morning air the stark reality of the transaction settled over her like a shroud. She found him in his study, a dark silhouette against the blazing morning sun, his back to the room. He was fully dressed in a crisp, dark shirt and trousers, his posture radiating a familiar, impenetrable authority. The broken man from the moonlit bedroom was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating mogul. He didn't turn as she entered. "It's done," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth or recognition. "Ms. Finch has settled the hospital's accounts in full. She has also arranged for a new residence and a permanent, private nursing staff for your mother. The funds are secured in a trust. You are free." Each word was a perfectly polished stone dropped into a deep well, the ripples spreading through her with chilling finality. He never mentioned the night before. He didn't have to. The omission was louder than any confession, a brutal confirmation that her surrender had been nothing more than the final clause in their contract. Humiliation was a physical force, a hot wave that rose from her stomach and burned her cheeks. She felt small and foolish, a pawn in a game whose rules she had never understood. To him, she was a problem that had been solved with money, a need that had been temporarily sated. She fled the study without a word, her movements clumsy, her hands shaking as she gathered her meager belongings. In the main living area, Ms. Finch stood waiting, her expression a mask of neutral efficiency that failed to hide a flicker of smug victory in her eyes. The silent descent in the elevator was an agonizing journey back to reality, each floor a painful marker of her fall from a grace she had only imagined. The city below, once a glittering promise, now looked like a labyrinth of concrete and glass, and she was more lost in it than ever before. The new apartment was a testament to Julian's chilling efficiency. It was spacious, modern, and utterly soulless, filled with expensive furniture that felt like it belonged to a stranger. Her mother was already settled in a state-of-the-art hospital bed, her face alight with a joy and relief that was painful for Clara to witness. "Clara, my darling, it's a miracle," Eleanor wept, clutching her daughter's hand. "That agency you work for, to have such a generous, anonymous benefactor. You saved me." The words, meant as the highest praise, felt like a condemnation. Clara had performed the miracle, but she had used dark magic to do it. Every gleaming piece of medical equipment, every comfortable chair, was a monument to her transgression. She had bought her mother's life and comfort, but the cost was a secret that now festered inside her, isolating her in the very sanctuary she had created. Meanwhile, high above the city, Julian Thorne was suffocating in the silence he had deliberately engineered. Pushing her away had been a primal instinct, a desperate act of self-preservation honed by a lifetime of expecting abandonment. He had awoken to the warmth of her sleeping form beside him and felt a terror so profound it nearly stopped his heart. To need another person this completely was to hand them a weapon, so he had severed the connection with surgical cruelty. Now, he paced the vast, empty rooms haunted by her ghost. The scent of her skin lingered on his pillows, a tormenting reminder of what he had possessed and then destroyed. He had secured her proximity through finance, but in doing so, he had murdered the very essence of what he craved, the genuine, unafraid tenderness in her touch. The penthouse was once again his fortress, but it had become a tomb. Clara moved through the following days in a numb haze, her life a strange paradox of relief and despair. The constant, grinding fear of debt and eviction was gone, replaced by a quiet, gnawing guilt. She couldn't bring herself to explain the truth to her mother, so she built a careful fiction around the anonymous donor, a story that grew more elaborate and suffocating with each telling. The lie was a wall between them, preventing any true intimacy. She would watch her mother sleeping peacefully, free from pain for the first time in years, and feel a surge of fierce pride immediately followed by a wave of self-loathing. She was living in the physical manifestation of her own moral compromise, and every moment of her mother's comfort was a fresh reminder of the night she had sold a piece of her soul to Julian Thorne. Weeks crawled by, measured in the quiet beeps of medical monitors and the silent weight of her secret. One afternoon, sitting by her mother's bedside, Clara looked down at her own hands, the hands that had brought her to this strange new life. She remembered their steady, professional movements on Julian's scarred skin, and then their trembling, uncertain touch as she had unbuttoned his shirt. In that moment, a profound shift occurred within her. The shame began to recede, replaced by something harder, more resilient. She had not been a passive victim. She had faced an impossible situation and had made a choice, a devastating, costly, but active choice. She had wielded her own compassion, her own body, as a tool to save the person she loved most. It was not a source of shame. It was an act of brutal, desperate strength. She was not broken. She was a survivor. In the sterile penthouse, Julian was deteriorating. He had hired a new nurse from the agency, a highly qualified professional, who approached his wounds with textbook precision and a barely concealed fear. Her touch was gloved, clinical, and always hesitant. She flinched when the lesions were at their worst, a tiny, almost imperceptible recoil that was like a physical blow to him. His pain, both physical and emotional, intensified. His body seemed to be rebelling against Clara's absence. He became increasingly volatile, his cynical cruelty sharpened to a razor's edge, until the new nurse quit. He was alone again, surrounded by his art and his wealth, trapped in the prison he had meticulously rebuilt around himself. The darkness Clara had held at bay was flooding back in, and he found himself drowning in it, a king, reigning over an empire of exquisite agony. Clara found herself ambushed by memories of him at the most unexpected times. It was not the powerful, intimidating millionaire she remembered, but the man in the moonlight, his defenses shattered. She would be washing dishes and suddenly recall the exact texture of a scar beneath her fingertips, the raw vulnerability in his eyes when he confessed his loneliness. The memory of his kiss was a persistent phantom, a ghost of sensation that made her ache with a feeling she refused to name. She had entered his world to be a healer, a caregiver, but she had been irrevocably changed. He had awakened a part of her, a deep well of desire, a capacity for fierce and complicated attachment that she never knew existed. She had thought her duty was to save him from his illness, but now she was forced to confront the terrifying possibility that they were meant to save each other. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows of the new apartment, a courier delivered a small, square package. It was wrapped in simple brown paper with no return address. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened it. Inside, there was no note, only a single, well-worn book of poetry by Rilke, an author she had mentioned in passing during one of their quiet, late-night conversations. It was not an apology. It was not a summons. It was a message, a quiet acknowledgement across the chasm of silence and wealth that separated them. It was proof that he remembered not the nurse he had employed, or the woman he had bought, but the person with whom he had shared a small, fragile truth. The book sat on her table, a silent, profound question. It was a bridge, flimsy and uncertain, and she knew with a terrifying clarity that the choice to cross it was hers alone. For 3 days the book of poetry lay untouched on her nightstand, a silent, heavy accusation. Clara didn't need to open it. She could feel the weight of his unspoken words through its worn cover. Her new life, the one she had purchased with her body and soul, was a masterpiece of sterile comfort. Her mother was thriving, surrounded by the best care Julian's immense wealth could provide, her laughter echoing in the spacious, sunlit rooms. But for Clara, the silence in this beautiful, hollow apartment was deafening. It was the silence of a life bought but not earned, a freedom that felt more like a gilded cage than the one she had left behind. The book was the only object that felt real, a tangible link to the storm of feeling she had experienced in his penthouse, a reminder of the man whose scars she knew better than her own heart. The decision came, as it often did for her, without fanfare or dramatic revelation. It arrived with the afternoon rain, a soft, persistent drumming against the window pane that mimicked the unsteady rhythm of her own thoughts. She looked at her mother, sleeping peacefully in a state-of-the-art bed, and felt a surge of love so pure it was painful. She had done her duty, she had saved her, but now a new duty was calling, one that was entirely for herself. She slipped out of the apartment, leaving a quiet note for the attending nurse. She didn't put on her old uniform, that symbol of service and sacrifice. Instead, she chose a simple gray dress, the color of the stormy sky, and hailed a taxi. As the car moved through the rain-slicked city streets, she felt not fear, but a strange, terrifying calm. She was no longer running from a debt. She was finally running toward herself. The ascent in the private elevator was a journey through memory. The polished chrome walls reflected a different woman than the one who had first ridden it weeks ago. That girl had been a bundle of nerves and righteous duty, a soldier marching into a necessary battle. The woman standing there now was quieter, her resolve forged in a fire that had burned away her naivete. She held the book of poetry in her hands, its corners softened with age, a fragile passport back into his world. When the doors slid open, the penthouse was just as she remembered. A vast, silent expanse of glass and art, a cathedral of loneliness. But her perception had shifted. She no longer saw it as an opulent prison, but as a carefully constructed fortress built to protect a deeply wounded heart. She saw the empty spaces not as a void, but as a silence waiting for a response. She found him in the gallery wing, standing before a massive canvas of chaotic, violent slashes of black and crimson. He held a glass of whiskey, his dark form a stark silhouette against the fury of the painting. He didn't seem surprised to see her, his posture betraying a weary resignation, as if he had been expecting this moment and dreading it in equal measure. He looked thinner, the shadows under his eyes deeper, and the ever-present tension in his shoulders seemed to have settled into his very bones. He didn't speak as she approached, the only sound the soft whisper of her shoes on the polished concrete floor. His gaze met hers, and in the piercing blue of his eyes, she saw not the cold tycoon, but the drowning man she had held in the moonlight, terrified of the lifeline she represented. Clara stopped a few feet from him, the space between them thrumming with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that hadn't been said. She didn't offer an explanation for her presence or an accusation for his dismissal. The transaction was over. This was something else entirely. She held up the small book of poetry, her gesture simple and direct. "You forgot to write in it," she said, her voice a soft anchor in the vast, silent room. The words were so mundane, so absurdly human in the face of their immense, complicated history, that they shattered the tension. A ghost of a smile, the first genuine one she had ever seen, touched his lips. It was a sad, broken thing, but it was real. He took a hesitant step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I didn't know what to write," he confessed, his voice rough, broken. He stood before her now, close enough that she could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body, close enough to see the profound loneliness that swam in the depths of his eyes. She looked down at the book in her hand, then back up at his face, at the geography of scars that told a story of pain she was only just beginning to understand. Their story wasn't over. It had been a prologue. The real narrative was about to begin, a difficult, uncertain text they would have to write together. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her free hand, the one that had tended to his wounds, with an unflinching touch. She held it in the space between them, her palm open, an offer and a question. It was a promise of acceptance, a quiet invitation to begin again, not as a nurse and a patient, but as two solitary souls reaching for each other in the dark. If you believe their scars can heal together, show your support by subscribing, liking this video, and sharing your hopes for them in the comments below.